Here's the question. Our shining city on the hill, our beacon of liberty, was founded by committing atrocities against Native Americans and taking their freedom and forcing them elsewhere and onto reservations. We've also not led the world in other things, such as the abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, civil rights, and women's rights. Does the good America has done simply outweigh the bad? What are your thoughts on this? My thoughts on this are as follows. There's no question that virtually everything in the first sentence anyway is essentially true. But I think that's an extremely progressive slander in terms of how things are going. And so, you have to be careful when you talk about things like the Indians and slavery and all that other stuff, because you don't want to come out sounding like you're defending the actual harm that we did do, and we did do an awful lot of harm, and there's an awful lot of things that America's done that America shouldn't be proud of, and I don't think you get any points defending things that you shouldn't be proud of. You shouldn't defend things that you shouldn't be proud of. Some things are indefensible, and some things are just utterly morally wrong, and so let's just start off by saying that, needless to say, slavery is an absolute moral evil, and the situation with the Indians is, at the very, very least, it's a historical tragedy. But now that I've said all those things, let me answer this question and bring some perspective here. So he starts off by saying we started off by committing atrocities against Native Americans. I'd be willing to bet you that most of the atrocities that were committed in the ongoing cohabitation between whites and Native Americans here in North America, I'd be willing to bet you that the initial atrocities were committed by the Native Americans. And I think there were plenty of scalps taken and a lot of raping and a lot of burning of homesteads that ever happened. Well, I know this is the case because we didn't have a cavalry. The Pilgrims didn't arrive with cavalry. The Pilgrims didn't arrive with guys in cuirasses and blunderbusses and axes and swords. The guys who first came to this country to live with the Indians were peaceful pilgrims. And so whatever atrocities were committed to start this running 400-year bloodbath were committed by the Native Americans. Period. They say that the Native Americans found the Pilgrims starving and gave them food, but if you actually get down to what really actually happened, it's only the ability to farm and to create agriculture that does the food production. If anybody's starving consistently across this spectrum of people, it was probably the the Indians. I'm going to call them Indians because that's what they like to call themselves. And that's their name, and it means Indians means Indios, people in God. They were thought to be noble savages by the people who named them. So the Indians, and by the way, Native Americans, as many people have said, do they want to be named after the people that conquered them? Native Americans means what? It means they were the first humans here, but they weren't born here. The Indians didn't grow up in North America. The Indians came from somewhere else, just like everybody else did. And so if you want to get down and start blaming the Europeans for colonizing the New World, you can also get down and blame the ancestors of the Indians who came over the Bering Straits 100,000 years ago, depopulated all the large animals in the country, like the giant ground sloth. The predecessors of the Indians did all of that. So just a couple things about the Native Americans that I think have gone just a little bit too far off into the side of hating the white man. First thing I'll say about this is, as I said, I think the first atrocities had to have been committed by the Native Americans. We didn't have an army. We didn't have the ability to commit atrocities or enforce our warpath will on anybody for the first century or two here. People think about Native American culture and they think about the noble Indian on the horse. And the tribes, the kind of Lakota, Sioux kind of Indian tribes on horseback out on the Great Plains. And that's how we all think of Indians. But the horse isn't native to North America. The horse was brought over by Europeans. The entire Indian culture, as we understand Indian culture, is only due to the horse, and the horse is due to introduction by the Europeans. So prior to the Europeans coming, there were no noble Lakota warriors on horses. They were on foot. And this business about the Indians being this collection of totally peaceful humans who did nothing but weave baskets and extend the hand of friendship to everyone they meet, and use every single part of the buffalo, and these moral angels that they're made out to be. It just doesn't work like that, and it historically is not true. All of the Indian tribes were with other Indian tribes for their entire lives, as is the true for primitive people everywhere. This idea that civilization, and European civilization especially, is particularly warlike is just not borne out by statistics. You find that the more primitive the society is, the more time it spends at war. And the most primitive societies are at war all the time. And the reason for that is pretty simple. The more primitive your society is, the more limited your resources are. The more limited your resources are, the more you are in competition to steal or disrupt other people's resources. And once you start farming, you suddenly have more food than you can eat yourself, as a general rule. So the idea that the North American Indian on his horse was there before we got there and just grew up out of the land is false on two accounts. Indians aren't from North America, and horses aren't from North America. Indians came over the Bering Strait, and the horses came over the Europeans. There's some evidence, it's reasonably compelling evidence, there's some evidence that it's possible that parts of the northeastern United States were settled by Europeans prior to the Asian people who came over from the Bering Strait on the other side of the country. There's some evidence of some European civilizations that may have actually predated them. I don't know if that's true or not. Let's go on a little bit more about this. This idea that we exterminated the Indians with biological weapons. We sent them, smallpox infected blankets. First of all, I think there's only one case that was ever historically shown to be that is what happened. And in all of those cases, they all happened before we had germ theory. People thought smallpox was caused by emissions from the air and decaying wood. Nobody knew that smallpox was transmitted through disease vectors because we didn't have any sense of the idea of germ theory. So the idea that we gave Indians blankets filled with smallpox as a means to exterminate them with biological weapons is just plain wrong. It's just not true. It just didn't happen. So when you hear Europeans say, well, yes, it's true the Nazis exterminated the Jews, but the Americans exterminated the Indians, you got a pretty big difference in the two situations there, and I can sum that up for you pretty easily. In the case of the Jews and the Nazis, men with guns went in and rounded up entire families of men, women, and children who didn't have guns, put them into camps and starved them to death, and then ran them into ovens and gassed them to death and killed them in mass numbers in order to exterminate them. The war between the white Americans and the American Indians was a war. It was a war that happened on horseback primarily between bands of warriors, our warriors versus their warriors. Our warriors occasionally, in cases like Wounded Knee, went in and massacred their women and children. But the number of Indian massacres of white women and children on an individual basis it's limitless. It's unnumbered. It's thousands and thousands of cases of Indian warriors massacring individual farmers and their wives and raping their wives and taking their children into slavery or killing their children. That's an ongoing battle between warriors. And I'm not an American Indian, but I've known a few of them, and the ones that I did speak to about this subject just danced around it, really. I didn't pretend to get the depth of their feelings about it. One thing I have noticed among modern American Indians is that they kind of resent this idea of this kind of kumbaya Indian, this idea of the Indian just being this peaceful weakling who just sat there and waited to be marched off into extinction. These were warriors, and they fought a tremendous battle, pitched battle that went on for 400 years and often beat far superior forces, at least technologically. They were brave. That's why they called their warriors braves. They were braves. They fought for their culture. Now, I think you can say without question that the greatest shame, I don't have any particular shame about the warfare aspect. I do, without question, find it absolutely appalling, absolutely inexcusable. And inexcusable and appalling the number of treaties that the American government broke with the Indians. It's just the most shameful thing we've done. I mean, it's certainly one of the two most shameful things we've done. That's the U.S. government. That's the government basically lying again and again and again and again and again. And that's just the truth. There's no way around it. That's what it is. But I'm going to get on to the other issues in a minute. But the point I want to make about the American Indians is simply this. This kind of thing has gone on throughout human history. There is no part of Europe, if you hear a Belgian or a European or a Frenchman talking about the way we treated the Indians, ask them what happened to the Celts or the Franks or the Angles or the Saxons. Where did they go? They were killed. They were killed. Europe is the bloodiest soil in the world. Same with China. A number of Chinese dynasties and the Mongols conquered the entire world, slaughtered everybody in their path, and the Egyptians slaughtered everybody in their path. And frankly, if you really want to make a case for native people in North America, you will have to look throughout history backwards and forwards, and you will never find a more repulsive, disgusting, horrific living nightmare on earth than the Aztecs, and to some lesser degree the Mayans and the Incas. The Aztecs were the worst civilization that's ever inhabited this planet, in my opinion. These people, these kind Native American people who live close to the land, and brown people who are authentic, not like these white killer apes that came over in boats. The Aztec people formed entire armies, and the armies would simply go up and down their territory and into neighboring territories simply to kill slaves, to capture slaves rather. The slaves would be brought back to their pyramids, and they would have their living hearts cut out from them, sometimes hundreds a day, and then they'd kick the bodies down those steep pyramids, and people down below would skin them and wear their skins for suits. Watch Apocalypto if you want to find out how noble American Indians can be. So what I'm trying to say here is this statement in this question was that America is just such an evil country. The case I'm trying to make is that the evils of America are not unique to America. And boy, we can have a lot more fun with this with slavery than we can with Indians. Because when you start talking about slavery, which again is an absolute moral evil, and there's no way to defend slavery as slavery, but when people try to make slavery a uniquely American disease, now you got some perspective to deliver on them. First thing to know about this is, if you took a look at the number of Africans taken out during the African slave trade, during the 400 or 500 years that people were taking slaves out of Africa, the first thing that you need to know is there are about 11 million Africans taken out of Africa. If you want to take a guess at the number of those people came to America to plantations in the South, how many of the 11 million? Most people would say 10 million, 11 million. It's actually 800,000 or 900,000. The huge majority of slaves pulled out of Africa went to the Caribbean. Almost all of them went to South America or the Caribbean. So the biggest slaveholders of the time, by a factor of almost 10 to 1, were not Americans. They were Europeans. They were Frenchmen in Haiti, and they were Englishmen throughout the colonies. There were any number of slaveholders all throughout that. So there's that. As far as the white man being uniquely evil as far as slavery is concerned, you have to also start asking questions about who delivered the slaves. Those white slave traders, didn't get off their ships and go roaming into the middle of the country, because once you realize that slave traders are on the coast, most people run inland. The huge percentage of the slaves that were sold to white slave traders were sold to them by other black Africans. Black Africans were the people that threw the nets over most of the black Africans that were sold into slavery. People don't want to hear that, but it's true. These black tribes on the coast of Africa, primarily on the eastern coast of Africa, would go inland in hunting parties, enslave huge numbers of fellow blacks, bring them to the coast, to some of these white slaver trade stations, and sell them to white slave traders for money. So they're in the slavery business too, but in addition to being in the slavery business, they're also traders to the degree that you could be a trader about this kind of thing. So, 10% of the total slaves sold came to America, 9%, 10%, and of most of the slaves that were captured, they're captured by other blacks. That tends to complicate the issue a little bit. Let's go on about this whole uniquely American thing about the slavery too. First of all, let's remember that all of the slaves, virtually without exception, almost all of the slaves that were brought to America, except for a period of 70, 80 years there, were brought to America when America was in fact a British colony. So the slaves that were brought to America to run the plantations in Carolina and the Carolinas and Georgia and Alabama, these were British colonies at the time. It was British people that brought those slaves to America because there hadn't been any Americans yet. And I think it also is an interesting little thought experiment to say, if you really want to run into people who maybe British people or whatever giving you this about this, slavery was abolished in Britain. I want to say it was 1846. It might have been 1844. I think it was 1846. If you take the founding of modern Great Britain as 1066, with the Norman invasion of Britain, William the Conqueror defeating Herod at the Battle of the Hill. What's it called? Oh, golly. flew right out of my head. Anyway, if you take the modern founding of Britain as 1066, Battle of Hastings, and they abolished slavery in 1846, you could say that at least from the beginning of modern Britain, it took them 800 years to abolish slavery. The United States abolished slavery 70 years or 80 years after its founding. So Great Britain abolished slavery in 1846, and they did it with the stroke of a pen, but they weren't dependent upon the slave trade. There were no economic reasons to keep slaves in Great Britain, so they abolished slavery with the stroke of a pen in 1846. We did it 20 years later when a significant portion of our economy was based on slavery, and we killed about 1 million people to do it. About 1 million white people died on both sides. The northern casualties were about 500,000 in combat, but probably more like over 1 million in terms of disease and everything else. Millions of Americans died, white Americans died, to end slavery in America 20 years, not 200 years and not 2,000 years after the British and the rest of the Europeans did it. And I'll go further by saying that that while Britain had abolished the slave trade in 1840s and abolished slavery in England in 1840s, the one thing that Britain didn't abolish was the results of the slavery, the economic benefits of the slavery, because Britain was the virtually entire market for Southern cotton. Virtually all of the cotton that was grown in the South by slaves was bought by the British to be used in their textile mills, where my family came from, up in Lancashire. My family were mill workers for 5-6 generations in Wigan, up in Lancashire. So, it's one thing to say, hey, no more slaves, but we're going to buy all of your slave labor, which is exactly what the British did. So again, this is not to defend slavery, and it's not to say that slavery was a good thing or a swell thing, or it's not to say that slavery isn't shameful. It's to say that slavery is today an ongoing disease, and that prior to the Industrial Revolution, it was the only form of controllable muscle power that a government could bring to bear with any degree of reliability. The pyramids were built by slaves. Virtually everything in the ancient world was built by slaves. Virtually everybody had slaves up until the founding of America and the Enlightenment. And so to blame slavery on America and to say that we liberated slaves late, we liberated slaves 7-8 decades after the founding of our nation, not 7 or 8 centuries after the founding of our national identity. I think that bears a little perspective, and I think it also bears perspective to say that any number of slaves were kept after slaves, that there are still slaves today, that there's slavery going on today. It's virtually all at the hands of Arabs. Arabs are enslaving Christians, are enslaving blacks. Other blacks are enslaving blacks. There's a slave trade of Koreans and so on going on. There's millions and millions and millions of people held as slaves today in the world today. Many millions more slaves today than there ever were at the height of the slave trade during the Confederacy. And those are actual physical slaves, not counting the mental slaves and the emotional slaves that the Democratic Party has created in order to keep themselves in power. I'm talking about actual slaves in chains. So I think a little perspective helps us there. And by the way, today, and for 100 years now, 200 years, freedom and slavery has been kind of a binary thing, right? You're either a completely free person or you're a slave. You're held in bondage. But at the time of the Revolution, and at the time of the founding of this country, and at the time of the Confederacy, there were many different degrees of what we would consider to be slavery today. And certainly slavery was at the bottom. You were another person's property. But there were indentured servants. There were people who were basically owed their entire livelihood to somebody else and were their slave until they could pay it off. There were forms of apprenticeship that really basically made that person a slave for 5 years or 10 years or whatever length of time it took them to free their apprenticeship. So indentured servitude and these kind of things were degrees of slavery that we look at today and say those people weren't free. And so, I'm just reluctant to judge people in the past by our standards because I just don't think it's fair. And I just don't think it's fair to them. And this question was just loaded with this. Let's move on. It says, we've not led the world. America's not led the world in the abolition of slavery. Didn't we? The British signed a piece of paper saying we're going to abolish slaves, but we don't have any slaves here. We've had them they've been legal for ever, but at least 800 years since the Norman invasion, but we're going to eliminate them now, even though we don't have any. So it's really no cost to us, but we'll continue to buy the product of slavery over there in the Confederacy. I don't see how that's leading the world in slavery. Leading the world in the abolition of slavery. Leading the world in the abolition of slavery is fighting a giant civil war and killing 1 million people to bring an end to slavery in this country. Civil war didn't start out about slavery, although it did, because when people talk about states' rights, it's about the right of people in certain states to own slaves. That's the only thing it was about. It's absolutely true that the British went around and took to destroying slave colonies and destroying slave ships at sea. But again, they did this 20 years before we did, not 2 centuries and not 5 centuries and not 8 centuries. They'd been around for a long time and tolerated it for a long time before they took action against it. They're the ones who brought the slaves to the New World in the first place, after all, and the French. So Haiti and French slavery continued on long after we'd abolished it, and it goes on today. As far as women's suffrage goes, I think it's a pretty long reach to say that America doesn't lead the world in women's rights. You may be able to make the case that women had the vote in other countries prior to us, but not way prior to the United States. And this idea of modern feminism is an American idea. I don't know anywhere else in the world where you see women employed on the kind of level that they're employed in America today, both as a percentage and in terms of height that they've achieved in their cultures. Certainly, I don't know of any other society in the world that goes to the kind of corrective efforts with things like Title IX and all of these advertisements that every single one of them today, the father and the man is a blithering idiot or is a man-child, and the woman is the sensible, rational, reasonable one who's filling out the checkbook, and so on. This idea that we have been lagging in women's suffrage is just not true. I don't know what the dates of the women getting the vote are, but there are many countries that have had it happen after us, and certainly in the vast part of the world today, all around the world today, with 100% truth in the Muslim world today, it's 1 billion people. Women are not even creatures; they're not even people by our standards. If you look at Asian cultures in Japan and China, women are clearly treated as inferiors. As a matter of fact, in China, they're preferentially just killed. They're just killed. You have a baby girl, leave it out in the woods to die. Throw it off a mountain, or you abort it preferentially. So this idea that we are somehow lacking the world in terms of respect for women is an absolute construct. It's not true. Women are not. There's no country in the world they're more highly respected than we have here. We've had women secretaries of state. Britain's had a woman prime minister. That's fantastic. I don't remember anybody in France. Germany's had a woman prime minister. But when you take the Islamic countries and you take Asian culture, you're talking about 2/3 of the world already. People are treated like chattel there. The condition of women in Japan and what they tolerate on subways to this day, and what their penetration into upper levels of management and leadership in corporations is zero. It's zero. So I don't buy your statement either, Brandon, about Americans lagging in women's suffrage. Civil rights, honestly, civil rights, I'm waiting to hear where civil rights are more clearly defended than they are in the United States of America. What does that mean? In America, we had a Bill of Rights, and we defend it. At least we used to. You had the right to speak your mind. You had the right to freely worship. These are all civil rights. If you're talking about civil rights, you're talking about racial equality and things like separate but equal and all of these, segregation and stuff. You can make the case that America has lagged to some degree, but that case doesn't stand, because the only place where America has so-called lagged in terms of things like integration is in places like France or Sweden. But France and Sweden don't have this issue to deal with, and neither did Britain, and neither did Germany, and neither did any of these places for the decades and the centuries that they've been talking about American racism. American racism was discussed by European countries with an attitude of snobby superiority by people like Belgians, who went into the Congo in the early 1900s, not in the 1800s, in the early 1900s, killed 10 million Congolese for King Ludwig's personal gain, his personal gain. Millions and millions and millions of Africans were killed for King Ludwig of Belgium in the 1900s. It's probably the greatest unknown atrocity of all time. Nobody says boo about that. And when you hear French people lecturing us about our racism and how we treat black people, black population in this country has been 10% or around there for 200 years. The percentage of black people in France was essentially 0%. It was Billie Holiday and one or two other American expatriates. And so they could treat them like celebrities and ooh and ah and all that other stuff. But they didn't have to deal with it until suddenly they did. And then starting in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, you started to see Algerians immigrating into France, and you started to see Pakistanis and Indians and other people immigrating into Great Britain, and you started to see Turks immigrating into Germany. And what you find is the level of racism in those countries certainly matches what the United States was at its worst, and certainly exceeds what the United States experiences today. The French will never incorporate the people in those neighborhoods, the Belus or whatever the French name for these unassimilated Muslims are. They'll never be French people. They will always have two different populations. They're never going to fully assimilate into Swedish culture, no matter how hard they try, because Frenchness and Swedishness and Britishness and all these other things are blood and race and location. Americanism is an idea. Somebody comes to America from Mogadishu, or they come from Oslo. They raise their right hands, swear to become law-abiding American citizens. They're as American as anybody else in this country. That is the only place where that happens. So basically, Brandon, I don't know whether your question was serious or not, but I throw it out on its heels. I completely just throw out the entire premise. I don't think we've lagged the world in these areas. I think if to the degree that we may be having a spotlight shined upon us about these issues, it's because we're the only country in the world that's had to deal with it. We're the only country in the history of the world that has ever had a slave population that did not either exterminate those slaves or has been overthrown by those slaves. We're the only country in the world that's ever had a slave population that we have made gigantic efforts to actually live with as equals. That's never happened before. And it was succeeding here very, very, very well, until the progressives came along and realized that the more integrated black people come into the culture, the more integrated black people become into the economy, the more they start to vote like Republicans. And so they will be constantly reminded of all of these things that either did occur, or exaggerations of things that didn't occur, or did occur, or just flat-out lies of things that didn't occur. I'll close this simply by saying you'll often hear black people today saying we built this country and the white people just sat around and stole our wealth. It's just not true. It's just not true. You can make a case that slave labor built most of the southern cotton economy. That case you absolutely can make. But unfortunately for the argument today, the southern plantation culture and that southern plantation economy was utterly destroyed in the Civil War, and everything that happened after that was accomplished by paid labor. The cities, the northern cities, were built by black workers to some degree, but by much larger percentages of white, Scottish, German, Italian workers. Everybody built America. This idea that black people built America and that white people are just sat around and watch it happen is just a pernicious lie. And black Americans are told that every day in order to gin up their resentment, in order to make sure that they keep voting Democrat in large numbers. And they're the largest percentage of the largest group of enslaved people in the history of this country are black Americans today. They live in a cage with a door that doesn't lock, and they're bound by shackles that don't clasp. They're slaves of their mentality. They're slaves of their brainwashing. And many people, I find, are slaves of their programming, of people who are trapped in cages that have the doors open. I'm really fascinated by this idea. It's one of the images I'm going to use an awful lot in the Common Sense Resistance. This is, in fact, the message of the Common Sense Resistance to the people of the world in 30 years from now is going to be: you are, in fact, the first generation in all of human history who have been slaves of a slaveholding society that has not had a gun to your head or chains around your ankles. You're the first generation of people who voted for slavery, who like slavery, or who make a decision to be slaves. They get the food pellet. So, there you go. By the way, about the racism thing, I guess I might as well just wrap up with one more thing. I might have mentioned this before. I was down in Guantanamo Bay a couple years ago, and there are two imported groups of people there. They import Filipinos to work on the base and Jamaicans. We're required to do this to show the rest of the world how great we are. We don't have American citizens doing most of the work on those bases around the world, at least certainly in Guantanamo. The huge numbers of civilian personnel on Guantanamo Bay Naval Station were Filipinos who did virtually all of the interior work, almost all of the hotel people and the housekeepers and that sort of thing were Filipinos, store clerks, and Jamaicans who did most of the exterior work. And I walked down there. I was down there in May and June, I guess, and I saw black Jamaicans out there in the 100-degree heat, 100% humidity, wearing baseball caps, goggles, scarf around the face, scarf around the neck, white button-down shirts, button to the neck, button to the sleeves, gloves, long pants, socks, and shoes. There was not an inch of skin showing, not an inch. I said, why are these people dressed like this? It's got to be unbearable under there. And the answer was that these Jamaicans are here doing a year or two of work, and when they go back home, if they go back home darker than they were when they came, they will have fewer economic opportunities, because in Jamaica it's just openly accepted that the lighter skin you have, the more economic opportunities you have. When Miss India was crowned, Miss Universe or whatever it was, there was an awful lot of outrage, really, in the country, because if you look at Indian culture, East Indian culture, you find that all of their stars, all of their celebrities, all of their movie stars, their TV personalities, all of their actresses and actors are all extremely light-skinned people. The Indian person, that maybe it was a U.S. person, maybe she became Miss America, I don't remember, but this person was much darker than what they see in India, and that kind of racism exists in India. It exists in China. It exists in Japan. You want to talk about racism? Go to Japan and try to go into Japan as a Korean person, see what kind of treatment you get there. This idea that America is this bastion of racism is just not true. There's no racism worse than there was in India. It still exists today. This business of caste and untouchables and classes of Brahmins on one hand and untouchables on the other, you're talking about 500 million people just utterly enslaved. It's just not true, Brandon. It's just not true. It's been sold to you as uniquely evil, but it's not uniquely evil. It doesn't mean that bad things didn't happen here, and it doesn't mean that there's a great number of things to be ashamed of in the history of America. But they're not unique to America. And in more cases than not, you'll find that not only are they not unique to America, America has made a particularly strong effort to correct those injustices in a way that other countries never have. You never hear anybody even talk about the Belgian Congo, let alone making it up to those people. That's what I would say about that. Moving on.